The Human Cycle by Sri Aurobindo. Chapter 3. The Coming of the Subjective Age. The materialism of the 19th century gave place first to a novel and profound vitalism, which has taken various forms from Nietzsche's theory of the will to be and will to power as the root and law of life to the new pluralistic and pragmatic philosophy, which is pluralistic because it has its eye fixed on life rather than on the soul, and pragmatic because it seeks to interpret being in terms of force and action rather than of light and knowledge. These tendencies of thought, which had, until yesterday, a profound influence on the life and thought of Europe prior to the outbreak of the Great War, especially in France and Germany, were not a mere superficial recoil from intellectualism to life and action, although in their application by lesser minds they often assumed that aspect. They were an attempt to read profoundly and live by the life-soul of the universe, and tended to be deeply psychological and subjective in their method. From behind them, arising in the void, created by the discrediting of the old rationalistic intellectualism, there had begun to arise a new intuitionalism, not yet clearly aware of its own drive and nature, which seeks through the forms and powers of life for that which is behind life, and sometimes even lays as yet uncertain hands on the sealed doors of the spirit. The art, music, and literature of the world, always a sure index of the vital tendencies of the age, have also undergone a profound revolution in the direction of an ever-deepening subjectivism. The great objective art and literature of the past no longer commands the mind of the new age. The first tendency was, as in thought, so in literature, an increasing psychological vitalism, which sought to represent penetratingly the most subtle psychological impulses and tendencies of man as they started to surface in his emotional, aesthetic, and vitalistic cravings and activities, composed with great skill and subtlety, but without any real insight into the law of man's being. These creations seldom got behind the reversed side of our surface emotions, sensations, and actions, which they minutely analyzed in their details, but without any wide or profound light of knowledge. They were perhaps more immediately interesting, but ordinarily inferior as art to the old literature, which at least seized firmly and with a large and powerful mastery on its province. Often they described the malady of life rather than its health and power, or the riot and revolt of its cravings, vehement and therefore impotent and unsatisfied, rather than its dynamis of self-expression and self-possession. But to this movement, which reached its highest creative power in Russia, There succeeded a turn towards a more truly psychological art, music, and literature, mental, intuitional, psychic rather than vitalistic, departing in fact from a superficial vitalism as much as its predecessors departed from the objective mind of the past. This new movement, aimed like the new philosophic intuitionalism at a real rending of the veil, the seizure by the human mind of that which does not overtly express itself, the touch and penetration into the hidden soul of things. Much of it was still infirm, unsubstantial in its grasp on what it pursued, rudimentary in its forms, but it initiated a decisive departure of the human mind from its old moorings, and pointed the direction in which it is being piloted on a momentous voyage of discovery, the discovery of a new world within, which must eventually bring about the creation of a new world without, in life and society. Art and literature seem definitely to have taken a turn towards a subjective search into what may be called the hidden inside of things, and away from the rational and objective canon or motive. Already, in the practical dealing with life, there are advanced progressive tendencies which take their inspiration from this profounder subjectivism. Nothing, indeed, has yet been firmly accomplished. All is as yet tentative initiation, and the first feeling out towards a material shape for this new spirit. The dominant activities of the world, the great recent events, such as the enormous clash of nations in Europe, and the stirrings and changes within the nations which preceded and followed it, were rather the result of a confused, half-struggle, half-effort at accommodation between the old intellectual and materialistic and the new, still superficial, subjective, and vitalistic impulses in the West. The latter, unenlightened by a true inner growth of the soul, were necessarily impelled to seize upon the former and utilize them for their unbridled demand upon life. The world was moving towards a monstrously perfect organization of the will to live and the will to power, and it was this that threw itself out in the clash of war, and has now found or is finding new forms of life for itself, which show better its governing idea and motive. The Asuric or even Rakshasic character of the recent world collision was due to this formidable combination of a falsely enlightened, vitalistic motive power with a great force of servile intelligence and reasoning contrivance subjected to it as instrument, and the genius of an accomplished materialistic science as its djinn, its giant worker of huge, gross, and soulless miracles. The war was the bursting of the explosive force so created, and even though it strewed the world with ruins, its after-results may well have prepared the collapse, as they have certainly produced a disintegrating chaos, or at least poignant disorder, of the monstrous combination which produced it, and by that salutary ruin are emptying the field of human life of the principal obstacles to a truer development towards a higher goal. Behind it all, the hope of the race lies in those infant and as yet subordinate tendencies which carry in them the seed of a new subjective and psychic dealing of man with his own being, with his fellow men, and with the ordering of his individual and social life. The characteristic note of these tendencies may be seen in the new ideas about the education and upbringing of the child that became strongly current in the pre-war era. Formerly, education was merely a mechanical forcing of the child's nature into arbitrary grooves of training and knowledge, in which his individual subjectivity was the last thing considered, and his family upbringing was a constant repression and compulsory shaping of his habits, his thoughts, his character, into the mold fixed for them by the conventional ideas or individual interests and ideals of the teachers and parents. The discovery of that education must be a bringing out of the child's own intellectual and moral capacities to their highest possible value, and must be based on the psychology of the child nature, was a step forward towards a more healthy, because a more subjective system. But it still fell short, because it still regarded him as an object to be handled and molded by the teacher, to be educated. But at least there was a glimmering of the realization that each human being is a self-developing soul, and that the business of both parent and teacher is to enable and to help the child to educate himself, to develop his own intellectual, moral, aesthetic, and practical capacities, and to grow freely as an organic being, not to be kneaded and pressured into form like an inert plastic material. It is not yet realized what this soul is, or that the true secret, whether with child or man, is to help him to find his deeper self, the real psychic entity within. That, if we ever give it a chance to come forward, and still more if we call it into the foreground as, quotes, the leader of the march set in our front, end quotes, will itself take up most of the business of education out of our hands, and develop the capacity of the psychological being towards a realization of its potentialities, of which our present mechanical view of life and man, and external routine methods of dealing with them, prevent us from having any experience or forming any conception. These new educational methods are on the straight way to this truer dealing. The closer touch attempted with the psychical entity behind the vital and physical mentality, and an increasing reliance on its possibilities, must lead to the ultimate discovery that man is inwardly a soul and a conscious power of the divine, and that the evocation of this real man within is the right object of education, and indeed of all human life, if it would find and live according to the hidden truth and deepest law of its own being. That was the knowledge which the ancients sought to express through religious and social symbolism. And subjectivism is a road of return to the lost knowledge. First, deepening man's inner experience, restoring perhaps on an unprecedented scale insight and self-knowledge to the race. It must end by revolutionizing his social and collective self-expression. Meanwhile, the nascent subjectivism, preparative of the new age, has shown itself not so much in the relations of individuals or in the dominant ideas and tendencies of social development, which are still largely rationalistic and materialistic, and only vaguely touched by the deeper subjective tendency, but in the new collective self-consciousness of man, in that organic mass of his life, which he has most firmly developed in the past, the nation. It is here that it has already begun to produce powerful results, whether as a vitalistic or as a psychical subjectivism, and it is here that we shall see most clearly what is its actual drift, its deficiencies, its dangers, as well as the true purpose and conditions of a subjective age of humanity, and the goal towards which the social cycle, entering this phase, is intended to arrive in its wide revolution.